Oh, it's not every day that something like this happens. Now, for those of you who are not aware, Adnan Syed, I believe that's how you pronounce his last name, Adnan Syed, has been in prison for over 20 years, and he was just released. Now, this story is a huge event. It became really popular because of the Serial podcast. I don't know if any of you are into that podcast or not, but it became really popular because of that, because there was new evidence that was brought forward. And I really do believe that that podcast aided in his release in a way, if you think about it. Eric said, justice for Adnan. Exactly. Just wait till you hear about this story. Before we get into the actual release, which happened just the other day, we are actually going to start with the timeline of events, because if you are not familiar with the story, I think it's important that you understand how we got to this place to begin with. So here is a timeline of Adnan Syed's case after his release from prison and what is next for the serial subject. So let's go ahead and let's start with 1998. In 1998, Hai Min Lee and Adnan Syed break up. So here is the picture of Hai Min. They were in a relationship and they broke up in 1998. Now, what happened after that is important. In 1999, Hai Min vanished. Her body is found 27 days later. So apparently, she actually went to school that day in January, left school, and wasn't seen again until 27 days later when they found her body. So, of course, one of the people that they are going to obviously look at as a suspect is most likely going to be her ex-boyfriend. He was very close to her, obviously. They broke up the year before. Now, let's go into some details here. January 13th, 1999, Lee vanished after leaving school. She was found dead 27 days later. Her body partially buried in a park. Now, police said at the time, Lee was strangled to death. Her ex-boyfriend, Saeed, was arrested in connection with her death and disappearance. He pled not guilty and has maintained his innocence to this day. So that is important to note. He pled not guilty. In 2000, Saeed is convicted. At trial, Jay Wilds, a friend of Saeed, testified against him and claimed the pair buried Lee in the park where she was found. Cell phone data also placed Saeed in the area, prosecutors said, although that data would later be called into question. So this is one of the ways and one of the reasons why they were able to convict him, because it was actually a friend of his that came out and testified against him and said that, yeah, we buried her body in the park. Obviously, now we know that was not true. So you do have to ask, what was his friend's motive to do that? Why would he go through, such lengths to say that his friend is guilty, knowing that this actually did not happen? So you have someone here who basically committed perjury. I'm not sure where this is going to go in reference to Jay Wilds. If he's still, around today, I don't know what's going to happen, but that's perjury. Let's go on. Yeah, I know Welch is great. Exactly. I know. Now, let's move on. We're in the year 2000, and this is a picture of Adnan Syed at that point in time. Saeed was found guilty of murder, false imprisonment, kidnapping, and robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison. Again, having that friend as a witness, I'm pretty sure was a strong case for why the jury was like, this guy is guilty. You have a person there that's close to you that's admitting to this. Sentenced to life in prison for a crime that apparently now we know he did not commit. Let's go on. this is a flaw with the criminal justice system. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to cover this story, other than the fact that this is huge breaking news, but it shows a flaw with the criminal justice system. In 2014, so they're fast forwarding 14 years here, Serial Podcast unearths new evidence. More than 15 years after Lee's killing, the Serial Podcast re-examined the case and revealed a key alibi witness who did not testify on Saeed's behalf. That's important. Asia McClain, who now goes by Asia Chapman, claims she was with Saeed at the library at the time Lee was killed. I do have to ask this question. Now, you can't make everybody, come forward. But if he was at the library with her at that time, you do have to ask, why didn't investigators contact her? Why didn't they even reach out to her? That was his alibi. Very strange, right? I would also wonder what he did at the library that day. Did he check out any books? If he did, there would be a record of that. Did he use the computer at the library for anything? There would be a record for that too. You have to log in. I'm not going to play detective though. Let's go back in. While McClain offered to testify, Saeed's attorney, Maria Cristina Gutierrez, who has since passed away, did not call her. Does anybody see this as a red flag? You mean to tell me the one person who knew where he was that day, who was with him, the one person that could actually verify his alibi, that person wasn't called to the stand to testify? Now, the lawyer is no longer with us. She has passed away. So it's not like you can contact the lawyer now and say, why didn't you let her come to the stand? I would really like to talk to a lawyer about this. I would really want to. And speaking of Olamide, I want to get her opinion about this. This is just so strange to me. Why would you do that? Going on, the podcast also questioned the credibility of the cell phone data used against Saeed and revealed that DNA found at the crime scene was never tested. Okay. Here's another problem. The DNA at the crime scene was never tested. Now, where have we seen this before? There is a documentary on Netflix called Making a Murderer. If you haven't seen it, watch it, at least the first season. One of the things that happened with Making a Murderer was the fact that, again, DNA was crucial to the first crime that he was convicted of. Remember, in Making a Murderer, he was convicted more than once. The first time that he was convicted and he served 18 years in jail, the DNA was never tested. That is key. If they would have tested the DNA, they would have known he did not commit the crime. So this is sketch. This is sketch. And we know, even though this was 1999 when this happened, we still know that DNA was already considered a thing at that point because of the O.J. Simpson trial, which was years before that. Let's go on. Millions of people tuned into the podcast, thrusting the case back into the spotlight and pressuring authorities to re-examine the facts. This is the same thing that has happened with Making the Murderer as well. It has been people doing these documentaries, these podcasts, the public coming forward, asking them to look at the case again. And this is another example where pressure from people on the outside can sometimes work. And in this particular situation, it worked. He's free now. So here's a picture of him here. 2015, Maryland's court agrees to hear Saeed's appeal. Now, this is where you thought he was going to get some type of momentum going here, but that didn't happen. In February 2015, following the success of Serial and the scrutiny it drew to the case, a Maryland court agreed to review Saeed's conviction. Remember, reviewing it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be overturned. In November of that year, a Baltimore judge issued an order that would allow Saeed to present new evidence, including the testimony of McClain, Saeed's alibi witness. So here's a picture here of Asia McClain. This is the woman that said she was at the library with him that day. Let's go on. 2016, Saeed's conviction vacated for the first time. In June 2016, Judge Welch overturned Saeed's conviction and granted him a new trial. This is where, again, we felt like there was going to be something was going to turn around here. Saeed's attorney, Justin Brown, argued that Gutierrez's failure to call McClain showed that she had mishandled the case. And I have to jump in here and I have to ask this question. And why would she do that? Why would she mishandle the case? We'll never know because she's dead now. It's interesting. Brown also argued that cell tower data that placed in the park where Lee's body was found and that was used to convict Saeed was unreliable, and that the prosecution failed to disclose evidence which would have called the cell phone's data reliability into question. That's also important. However, even after Judge Welch's ruling, Saeed remained incarcerated as the state appealed the ruling and the case wound its way through the courts. So he still remained in prison all those years, even after the judge's ruling. At a news conference after the judge's order, Brown said, "We made a lot of progress, but we are not there." So that was 2016. So he stayed in prison still for a couple of years up until now, 2022. Let's go on. There's a picture of him there. At the time, Lee's family issued a statement expressing their continued belief in Saeed's guilt. "We continue to grieve." That was coming from the family. "We continue to believe justice was done when Mr. Saeed was convicted of killing High." So that's coming from the victim's family. They still believe that he was guilty. 2018, ruling to vacate Saeed's conviction upheld by appeals court. In March 2018, an appeals court upheld Judge Welch's 2016 decision to vacate Saeed's conviction and grant him a new trial. In the Court of Special Appeals opinion, Chief Judge Patrick L. Woodward wrote that a deficient performance by Gutierrez, her failure to call McClain, prejudiced Saeed's defense. So we have a faulty attorney. And we saw this happen recently as well. I called it out before with the former football player, Julius Jones, I believe was his last name. I talked about this. I think it was last year I covered this story, or it might have been a couple months ago. I forget. Covered a lot of stories. Anywho, he had a similar situation where his attorney didn't do his job as an attorney. There were key facts that were left out of that incident that happened with Julius Jones. Now he's still in prison, but because of the pressure from the people from the outside, the governor stepped in and told the prison not to execute him. They were going to execute him the day of. All the pressure from the people, the community, and we covered it here on this show and told people to call in. That is what really pushed the governor to say, okay, maybe we should not, well, he was already sentenced to death, but maybe we should not execute him after all. But Julius Jones is still in prison. Similar situation, though. He had a faulty lawyer. Woodward wrote that there is a reasonable probability that McClain's alibi testimony would have raised a reasonable doubt in the mind of at least one juror. And that was pretty much all they needed. about Saeed's involvement. High's murder and thus the results of the proceedings would have been different. 2019, a setback for Saeed. Maryland's highest court upholds the conviction. See, again, this is a problem with the criminal justice system. This is how people stay in the system for so long. Saeed suffered a setback in March 2019 when Maryland highest court of appeals ruled in a 4-3 decision to uphold his conviction. The court agreed that Saeed's counsel during his murder trial had been inadequate, but they held that Saeed was not prejudiced by his poor counsel. I disagree with that. I think they are wrong here. How can you not call a key witness? How can you not call the person that can actually corroborate his story, corroborate his alibi? I don't understand that. In a statement after the ruling, Brian Frosh, who is Maryland's Attorney General, justice was done for Hyman Lee and her family. Now, that came from the Attorney General. So in November 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Saeed's case. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court. They didn't want to hear it. Now, granted, they get several cases that are sent to them, multiple. They can't hear every case, but still. Now, let's go on here to this year, 2022. Saeed's conviction overturned again. He leaves prison. September 19th, Saeed was released from prison after Baltimore Circuit Judge Melissa Finn vacated his conviction. News of Saeed's release came 5 days after Baltimore prosecutors filed a motion to vacate the conviction. In the motion, State Attorney for Baltimore City, Maryland Mosby, said that after a nearly year-long investigation by the state and defense, new information was discovered, including the possible involvement of alternative suspects. And I'm glad they mentioned this piece here, alternative suspects, which means also whoever murdered Hyman Lee is still out there. Something to keep in mind. Mosby said prosecutors will continue their investigation and bring a suspect or suspects to justice. However, she did not comment to declaring that Saeed is innocent. We're not yet declaring that he's innocent because we still have pending DNA. This happened in 1999. How do you still have pending DNA? But we are saying in the interest of fairness and justice, he's entitled to a new trial. It is re-traumatizing them because they thought that they had a resolution and closure when in all actuality, they didn't. My job is to do the right thing. And if you have to have the fair and just result in order to ensure the right person is held accountable, that is in reference to the victim's family. So what is next for Saeed? After his release from prison, Saeed was placed on home detention with a GPS monitor. The state has 30 days to reschedule a date for a new trial, but it is unclear if the state will pursue a new conviction. And there he is there. We have a faulty criminal justice system. Saeed has been in prison for, over 22 years now? He's free now, but he doesn't get those 22 years back. All because of one faulty, incompetent lawyer who would not let his alibi witness testify. And you have to question that. You have to question it. Now, there is a video clip here that I do want to show you as well, just to show you a visual. So let's go ahead and get into that.
Adnan Syed, who was serving a life sentence after he was convicted in 2000 of murdering his high school ex-girlfriend, Hyman Lee. Adnan Syed is free from prison for now. Syed's case, of course, was made famous through the podcast Serial, and a subsequent HBO series. A Baltimore judge today approved a motion to vacate Syed's conviction and released him under home detention, and now prosecutors have the choice of either dropping the charges or retrying the case. This hearing comes after prosecutors asked for a new trial last Wednesday, citing newly introduced evidence which revealed two other possible suspects. To be clear, prosecutors are not saying that Syed is not guilty. Instead, they're saying they have no confidence in his past conviction and that keeping him in prison as they continue their investigation would be unjust. CNN's Alexandra Field is following this case for us closely. Alex, tell us more about what happened at today's court hearing.
Look, you saw.
I also wonder if he can sue. I wonder if he can sue them.
Some of that emotion as he left the courthouse. That is what was happening inside the courtroom as well. Tears and cheers going up as the judge decided to vacate the life sentence against Adnan Syed. He was in that courtroom, the hearing lasting about 2 hours with a 30-minute recess in between. This was a time where the prosecutors were able to lay out the evidence they had presented in their motion, evidence that was gleaned from a year-long reinvestigation into the case that really did focus on this newly developed information about two alternative suspects and also a failure of the state, as told by the prosecutors, to share some of that existing information about two alternative suspects with the defense at the time of the trial. That argument seemingly enough to sway the judge to vacate the sentence. During the hearing, we also did hear from Hae Min Lee's family, her brother, zooming in to speak on behalf of the family, reminding those in the courtroom that for him, this is not a podcast, this is real life. While we did hear from prosecutors as soon as the decision to vacate the sentence was handed down, we did also hear from an attorney representing the Lee family who had this to say. This family is interested in the pursuit of justice. They want to know more than anybody who it was that killed Hae Min Lee. Jay?
So the prosecutors are waiting to decide whether they will drop the charges until they get the results from the DNA test. What do we know about that?
Right. So they are making it very clear that this is not a declaration of their belief in his innocence. They say that this is an opportunity to move forward with the investigation. They want to ensure that justice is being served, that there is adequate representation for Adnan Syed should there be a future trial. They say that a decision to go to trial will now hinge on pending DNA results. They're doing touch testing for DNA. This is a type of testing that was not available at the time that Syed was convicted, so they're trying to expedite the results there, see what they can glean from those results before deciding whether to go to the new trial or dismiss charges altogether.
Okay, I got to jump in here about the DNA testing here. The DNA should have been tested in 1999. Period. There's different types of DNA testing that you can do. Should have been tested then to see if it did match his DNA. First problem. Second problem, she says, well, this type of DNA testing wasn't available at the time. Did it just become available this year? I don't think so. This is a huge problem with the criminal justice system that we have in this country. How do you go this long? This event happened in 1999. She was murdered in 1999. He's been in prison over 20 years. How does this happen? I don't get it. I really don't. Something is shady here. Something is a little rotten in Denmark. I don't know if it's just necessarily the faulty lawyer, but something with this particular case is a little strange.
Saw Adnan Syed leaving the courtroom today, I think wearing an ankle monitor. What's next for him?
Yeah, he will be under electronic home surveillance while the investigation continues and until there is a decision on whether or not to dismiss charges or proceed with the new trial. But really, you can't underestimate or underplay the enormity of this decision. Look, the defense has worked for more than 2 decades to try to appeal this conviction. Adnan Syed has, for years and years, maintained his innocence in the murder of his ex-girlfriend. This is a day that came, we have to remind ourselves, not just because of the defense's efforts to clear him or exonerate him. It is something that came because the prosecution was part of the reinvestigation and brought forward this motion to vacate these charges. Really a stunning development.
All right.
I would actually argue that had it not been for that podcast, would we be here today? Had it not been for the serial podcast that brought forth new information, would he be free today? That's something to think about. But we have to do better. Our criminal justice system is a joke. This is a joke. I'm going to go to some of the comments here in the chat. Eric says, Jay Wild's story changed repeatedly. He admitted to lying. That alone, I felt like should have given him a new trial. That here you go. You had someone who committed perjury in court and no one was questioning this. Like, we need to bring forth a new trial. How is this possible? Robert says, our judicial system isn't about justice. It's about getting someone for a crime and closing the case, right or wrong. That's a good point. C. Larson, Christina Gutierrez, the lawyer, was also disbarred in 2001. She died in 2004. I don't know. This is a little strange to me. Delthea says, oh, he can sue. I hope he winds up owning the courthouse. Eric says, best podcast about Saeed's case is Undisclosed at undisclosedpodcast.com. Thanks so much for that, Eric. Yeah, it's just, I just don't understand. And it's a waste of resources too. He's been in prison all this time for over 20 years when they could have been looking for the person who actually did kill Hyman Lee. A waste of taxpayer dollars. You guys realize this, right? It's our tax money. I don't know what else to say about the criminal justice system, but it's a mess in this country. It's an absolute mess. Something has to change. Something has to, we need something different here, I think. I don't know. How do you get your life back after all those years? So shout out to those who hosted the Serial podcast. I remember a friend of mine loved that podcast. She's listening to it all the time because they brought forth new information. And that's something, you get the public excited and riled up. And then they start calling people, whether it's their congressmen or attorney generals, whoever, and say, you need to look at this case again, right? But we shouldn't even have to do that. It's their job to do what's right by the law, to give people a fair trial. And based on what I've read, it doesn't sound like he had a fair trial. If you're not letting a witness testify, really? Very strange. Very strange. And it's your client. It's your client. And you're not going to bring forth a witness that could clear their name. Wow. Interesting.